Why do you think they're not doing that? For instance, the readout of the call was that it was very pleasant. President Putin, or from the Kremlin, I think, came the description that neither Putin nor Trump wanted to even hang up and say goodbye to each other. They were having such a good time. There was no mention of a ceasefire, apparently, and there was no move towards sanctions, even though the US and Europe had floated both those things, ceasefire and sanctions, if Putin didn't agree. Why do you think this is still the White House, at least its public position towards Russia?
Well, I think Putin's goal is pretty clear. He wants to subjugate Ukraine, divide Europe, and weaken us. And he wants to keep us on side. So he clearly is going to do everything possible to make it seem like we can work together and potentially agree to things like starting negotiations to end the war, but then to slow roll those negotiations or to create demands that are completely unacceptable on basic principles and values, not just to Ukraine, but to the United States, like allowing borders to be changed by force and recognizing those actions. So I can't explain why exactly we are doing what we're doing. I can just say that based on my experience and very long experience dealing in this part of the world with the Russians, is that you have to be very clear on what your red lines are. You have to make sure that you don't give concessions in advance. And once agreements are made, they have to be verified. It's really a trust but verify situation. And I think that's my advice when dealing with the Russians, especially on issues like this.
Mm-hmm. And that, I mean, by virtue of what you're saying, clearly that wasn't the case. There was no trust but verify. And I think people think there were too many concessions given. You know, Secretary Rubio now says that threatening to impose more sanctions on Russia could just cause Moscow to stop talking about ending the Ukraine war.
I disagree with that. I think pulling your punches with Russia is exactly what allows Putin to extend the war and to create more demands. So I think a clear, firm, principled stand is the best way to counter Russian aggression, and that done together with partners and allies. So I don't agree that we should be pulling our punches in calling out who started this war, calling out the fact that Russia continues to this day to send missiles and drones to Ukraine, including the night before the call. There were 273 drones launched at Ukraine. That's the largest number since the beginning of the war. And including just overnight, another 73 drones were launched at Ukraine. I think to get to the point of an end of the war that's in our interest, we have to be clear and principled.
Ambassador, we've watched President Trump sort of vacillate in his public demeanor towards Putin. Sometimes he appears to be offering carrots. They say to sweeten the pie, in other words, to bring him into talks rather than just alienating him from the beginning. Others say that, you know, he really does believe the Russian narrative. But what he's done has changed his tone. There was the Oval Office tone. Then there was the Vatican tone when he looked to be much more listening to Zelensky. Then there was the Vladimir stop tone when Putin had sent in a whole barrage of missiles and drones that killed a load of civilians. What do you... And now he says nothing will change until I meet Putin. What do you think is going to happen next?
Well, I think to achieve the goal of ending the war, what we need to do as an administration, and my advice would be to President Trump, is to put more sanctions on immediately. The Europeans have just increased sanctions, especially on areas of the energy sector. It's the oil and the sale of oil that is a big part of fueling the war machine. We have done a little bit of that under the previous administration, but we could do much more. Also, there are other types of sanctions in the banking sector and other things that we could do that could put more pressure on Russia to bring Putin seriously to the table. I also think we need to get at the $300 billion, which is Russian sovereign assets that are mostly frozen in Europe, and use those to help Ukraine defend itself. And that can be used to buy weapons in the United States that could replenish our own defense industrial base, but also help Ukraine be a stronger country against Russia.
Do you think the previous administration, which after all started and gathered all of NATO and kept a unified front, should have used its time to provide more weapons in a more timely way?
Well, I lived through that period, and I think history is going to review and show what all of us did, what the United States did, what Europe did, what the Ukrainians did, and the result of that. My focus in this moment is to look forward and to try to make the case that how this war ends is really important to the United States.
You're definitely dodging that question, because a lot of people believe that how this war ends could have been determined by the amount of, of aid and assistance in a more timely manner. So you're okay with the way that went?
I think this is something we'll have to review in the course of time. And I also think it's what we did. It's also what others did. And I think it's easy to Monday morning quarterback what happened over those 3 years.
Right, but it's not just
But I don't think it changes what happens next.
Well, maybe not. Maybe not.